Perhaps the most mysterious thing each night is not the dream itself, but the moment your consciousness quietly leaves this familiar world, and you almost never even notice it. Welcome to the Sleep by Knowledge channel. Tonight, we're going on a journey that is very slow, very deep, and also very strange, to see how consciousness changes as a person gradually drifts into sleep. Because sleep does not arrive like a door slamming shut in a single second. It comes like a thin layer of mist settling over your thoughts, softening time, making the images in your mind begin to shimmer and fade, turning distant sounds vague, and gently loosening the daytime self from reality. You may have lain still in the dark and felt that you were still awake, while your thoughts had already started drifting into scattered fragments. You may have jolted suddenly with the feeling that you were falling. You may have heard a faint sound, seen an image flash and disappear, or woken up wondering how a dream could have felt so real. None of those things are meaningless scraps. They are traces showing that consciousness does not simply switch off when we fall asleep. It changes levels, changes rhythm, and changes the way it experiences itself in the world. If you stay with this journey all the way through tonight, you will understand why the moment of falling asleep feels both familiar and mysterious, why the brain can lead us from clear thought into such delicate regions of sensation, and why human consciousness, when night falls, does not disappear at all, but quietly becomes something else. And maybe after this video you will look at your own sleep with a gentler view, with less anxiety, and with a deeper sense of understanding. If you truly enjoy quiet and soothing journeys like this one, please like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you genuinely want to stay with Sleep by Knowledge for the long run. Before we begin, lower your screen brightness, adjust the volume to a comfortable level, relax your body, and if there is one fact tonight that surprises you most, leave a comment below. Now, let us step into the most delicate moment of every night, where consciousness does not disappear, but silently changes form in the dark. And it is right here, as the room slowly slips away from your attention, as your eyes no longer need to look at anything more, that we arrive at the first truth, and also the most important truth, of tonight's journey. Consciousness does not switch off the moment we fall asleep. It does not vanish like a lamp when someone flips the switch. In sleep science, the moment sleep begins is understood as a complex transitional process, where subjective feeling, behavior, physiological rhythms, and brain activity all change gradually together. That is why there are moments when you feel that you're still here, still hearing the fan, still aware of the pillow beneath your head, still faintly aware that you're lying in your familiar room, and yet your consciousness has already begun to leave behind the sharp, clear kind of presence it has during the day. It does not disappear, it simply changes the way it is present. And from that very moment, the deepest mystery of sleep begins to reveal itself. As a person slowly sinks into the night, consciousness does not vanish all at once, but fades layer by layer in the thinnest, gentlest way. Most of us have lived through that moment without ever really having a name for it. You lie still, your body is quiet, but your mind has not completely agreed to become quiet with it. One last thought from the day is still there, like a thread that has not fully snapped. Maybe you are thinking about a conversation you just had, something you need to do tomorrow morning, or a face that suddenly drifted into your mind. Then, very slowly, that line of thought, which had once been neat and straight, begins to soften. The story in your head is no longer as organized as it was when you were fully awake. Thoughts no longer follow one another in the same clean order. An image slips in for no reason at all. A tiny detail suddenly feels larger than it should. You can still hear a sound from outside, but it no longer matters the way it did before. This fits very closely with what we currently understand about the shift from wakefulness into sleep. The brain does not jump from one state to another in one clean leap, but moves through a blurred borderland where awareness, attention, and the ability to hold on to the outside world gradually begin to weaken. Consciousness is still there, but it is less rigid, less bright, and less determined to control everything. When scientists observe sleep through recordings of the brain's electrical activity, they see that the first stage of sleep is a very light zone of sleep, a kind of first leaning of the mind into darkness. This is the moment when the signs of relaxed wakefulness begin to decrease, slower rhythms begin to appear. The eyes may move slowly, muscle tone starts to soften, and the body no longer keeps the same level of readiness it has while awake. This stage is short, usually only a small part of the whole night, but it matters deeply because it is the first doorway to everything that follows. If daytime is when consciousness stands upright in front of the world, then this is the moment when consciousness begins to sit down. It is not deeply asleep yet, not fully submerged, not separated from everything, but it has already stopped looking at life through daylight. That is why many people, when awakened at exactly this point, will insist that they were not asleep at all. That answer may sound wrong, but it is actually very human. In this transitional zone, the subjective feeling of consciousness and what the body is truly doing do not always line up perfectly. You have probably had this very familiar experience. You lie down, you still think you are completely awake, and yet when you look at the clock, a short stretch of time has already passed and you cannot really say how it went by. That is because when consciousness begins to change levels, the feeling of time changes with it. Time in the threshold of sleep does not move the way it does in waking life. It becomes softer, stripped of its usual landmarks, like a road in the fog that you're still walking down, even though you can no longer see each stone under your feet. In sleep research, this opening stage is one of the hardest stages to define clearly, because its boundaries shift and there is no absolute line between still awake and already asleep. That helps explain why people so often become confused about the exact moment they truly fall asleep. And it also reveals something quietly beautiful about consciousness. It does not live by lines that are too sharp. It knows how to move into darkness in a way that is slower, gentler, and far more human than we usually imagine. If you look more closely, you will see that when consciousness changes form, it does not keep noticing everything at once in the same way, but begins to change what it chooses to hold on to. During the day, consciousness clings tightly to work, language, goals, schedules, and the names of things. But when night arrives and that first door begins to open, consciousness starts pulling its energy away from those things. It no longer wants to cling so tightly to hard logic. It cares less about order. It becomes less interested in deciding what matters most in that moment. That is why a small sound, like the hum of a fan or distant rain, may not disappear, but instead drifts toward the edge of awareness. A thought about tomorrow does not fully vanish, but it no longer carries the same weight it had in the afternoon. And a very light physical feeling, like your shoulders dropping or your breathing growing longer, can suddenly become clearer instead. In this moment, consciousness is no longer standing at the window looking out at the world. It is beginning to turn inward, into the house of itself. That may sound poetic, but it is very close to how science describes the gradual weakening of outward attention and the changing patterns of brain activity at the edge of sleep. We often think of sleep as something that belongs to the brain, but at this first doorway, the body is also a very important storyteller. Muscles begin to loosen. The face stops holding those tiny expressions of guardedness. Breathing may become slower and more even. Body temperature, following the larger biological rhythm of the night, is also moving in the direction that helps sleepiness grow stronger. The internal biological clock in the brain responds to light and darkness in order to regulate wakefulness and sleepiness across 24 hours. When night comes, the darker environment helps guide the body toward rest, and that rhythm creates the background that allows consciousness to soften. So drifting into sleep is not simply a decision of the mind. It is a gradual agreement between the brain, the body, darkness, biological rhythm, and the weight of all the hours that came before while you were awake. Consciousness does not lower the curtain by itself. The whole body gently carries it down. There is something especially striking here that many older adults often feel more clearly than younger people, even if not everyone has words for it. The more years people live, the more they may notice that the moment of falling asleep can become more fragile, more easily pulled back by a sound, a worry, or a small stream of thought. Well, that does not mean consciousness is weaker. More than anything, it shows that the doorway between waking and sleep has always been a delicate one. Sleep science has long shown that sleep stages are not exactly the same in every person and can change with age, health, lifestyle, and light exposure. But whether a person is 30 years old or 70 years old, the core principle remains the same. As we gradually sink into sleep, consciousness does not disappear right away, but moves through a kind of inner season change. What makes that season so touching is how human it is. We still hold on to one corner of the world, but our grip has loosened. We still know who we are, but that self is no longer standing upright the way it does in the daytime. And it is precisely when the daytime self begins to step back that very strange yet very normal experiences can appear. An image may flare up for an instant, like a room, a face, a streak of light, a staircase, even though you are not trying to imagine it. A sensation of movement may pass through you, even though your body is still. A sound may seem real, even though the room remains quiet. Science calls this the hypnagogic state, a transitional state between wakefulness and sleep, where sensory experiences and mental images can appear vividly, but do not yet have the stable structure of a full dream. What matters is that these experiences are not evidence that consciousness has already disappeared. On the contrary, they show that consciousness is entering a different mode of activity, one that is less controlled by daytime logic and more open to association, sensation, scattered memory, and vague signals rising from within. In other words, just when we think consciousness is retreating, it is actually revealing forms of itself that we rarely see in the daylight. One of the most common experiences at that threshold is the feeling of falling. You are almost asleep, and then suddenly it feels as though your foot slips downward, as though your body drops from an invisible step, and you jolt back into the bed. The feeling is brief, but very real. It makes many people think that something deeply mysterious is happening. In fact, in scientific descriptions of the hypnagogic state, sudden movement sensations, falling sensations, or the feeling of being pulled have been recorded for a long time. They are part of the transition, not something unnatural standing outside it. And if you look at it from the perspective of consciousness, it is an incredibly beautiful detail. It proves that as we fall asleep, consciousness does not simply dim, but also changes the way it builds the feeling of the body and of space. The body is still lying there, but consciousness may feel motion. The room does not change, but consciousness may suddenly feel itself slipping away from it for a fraction of a second. That is why the edge of sleep is not empty at all. It is a richly active region where consciousness lets go of certainty without falling straight into nothingness. There is a gentle paradox here that sleep science helps us see. The less we try to force ourselves to sleep, the more easily we can pass through that first doorway. That does not mean giving up on sleep. It means using less of the daytime style of control to interfere with a process that needs softness. When people become too vigilant about whether they have fallen asleep yet, too focused on checking whether consciousness has switched off, they unintentionally keep one part of consciousness standing there as the gatekeeper. In research and clinical descriptions of the mismatch between subjective sleep experience and objectively measured sleep, it becomes very clear that the feeling of I am still awake can remain vivid and convincing even when the body has already begun moving through the lighter stages of sleep. This is especially noticeable in people with paradoxical insomnia, but it also helps us understand something broader. Consciousness is not a perfect clock that can accurately report its own condition at every moment. Sometimes it believes it is still fully lit, even when in reality it has already dimmed quite a bit. And that is not something to fear. It simply shows that consciousness is a complicated storyteller. If we look at a whole night of sleep as one long journey, then this first doorway is the opening line. After that, the brain usually moves through several cycles, each one lasting about 80 to 100 minutes, shifting between non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep, with 4 to 6 cycles in a night being common in healthy adults. The deeper parts of the night bring other stories: deeper sleep, more vivid dreams, and more obvious changes in memory and emotion. But all of that begins here, in the first moment when consciousness agrees to become less bright. Without that first threshold, no night truly opens. It is like twilight, not fully dark yet, but the day has already withdrawn. And like twilight, it is both the ending of one world and an invitation into another. Consciousness does not leap across an abyss, it walks through dusk. The more carefully we think about it, the more we understand why people throughout history have always found the moment of falling asleep both familiar and hard to grasp. It is familiar because everyone has passed through it countless times. It is hard to grasp because consciousness in that moment has already lost some of its ability to record things faithfully the way it does while fully awake. We cannot carry all the light of daytime with us into the night. One part of consciousness has to learn how to release the instinct to control, release the need to understand everything immediately, release the habit of forcing everything into one coherent story. That is why the threshold of sleep is often felt more as a sensation than remembered in words. You may remember the fan, the darkness, one final thought, but not the exact moment when your consciousness stopped standing in the middle of the room and began withdrawing inward. That is not a flaw in memory, it is the nature of the transition itself. Consciousness does not sign its name clearly when it leaves its daytime shift. It simply passes very quietly through a half-open door. And perhaps the most comforting part lies right there in that truth. Many people fear the night because they fear the feeling of losing control. They fear not knowing when they will fall asleep, fear the sensation of drifting into a place they cannot fully hold on to, fear the blurred stretch between waking and sleep. But if we understand that consciousness is not swallowed at once by darkness, and instead gradually shifts into another kind of presence, then we can begin to look at sleep more gently. When you lie there and feel your thoughts losing their sharpness, that does not mean you are losing yourself. When you hear a sound and then feel it sink into the background, that does not mean you are leaving reality in panic. When time begins to soften, that does not mean you are entering some frightening void. It means consciousness is doing what it has done every night for a very long time, leaving the day in the slowest, gentlest, most discreet way it can. It does not disappear, it learns another language. And sometimes, simply understanding that can make us struggle with the night a little less. So if tonight we keep only one thread running through everything that follows, let it be this: consciousness changes as we gradually sink into sleep. It does not suddenly go dark. It begins with a very light stage of sleep, where thoughts lose their old outlines, where the sense of time changes rhythm, where the body becomes less tense, where the outside world drifts a little farther away, where delicate images may flash into view, and where the clear, wakeful self of the daytime moves into the background without disappearing at once. From here, the first door has opened, and once we understand how that door works, we no longer have to look at sleep as some nameless black hole. We can see it instead as a journey with structure, rhythm, science, and still enough mystery to make a person grow quiet before it. It is from this soft doorway that consciousness continues into deeper regions of the night, where images, emotions, memories, and dreams begin to weave together. But none of that could happen if from the very first moment consciousness had simply vanished. It did not vanish. It quietly changed form. The reference sources for this main section include public educational material from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke on the Stages of Sleep, materials from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute on sleep cycles and phases, specialist chapters from the National Library of Medicine on the physiology of sleep stages and circadian rhythms, along with review articles on PubMed Central about sleep onset, the hypnagogic state, and the difference between subjective sleep experience and objective sleep measurement. And then, the moment the first door of sleep begins to open, consciousness moves into a much stranger region, a place almost everyone has touched at least once, but very few people know how to name. This is when very brief, very delicate, very rapid experiences can appear like little flashes in the darkness of the mind, a face passing by for an instant, a streak of light with no clear source, a sound that seems to come from outside the door, a feeling as if your foot just slipped off the edge of a step. What makes those moments so unforgettable is that they feel real, yet not completely part of the waking world. In sleep science, this state is called the hypnagogic state, the transition from wakefulness into sleep, where sensory experiences can appear even though consciousness has not disappeared, but is only changing the way it works. And right here, the main message of tonight's journey becomes especially clear. Consciousness does not suddenly switch off when we drift into sleep. It simply stops operating the way it does during the day, and in that brief shift of mode it reveals images and sensations that we rarely get to witness in ordinary waking life. Many people hear about seeing images while they are falling asleep, and immediately think of something mysterious, maybe even frightening. But if we look at it more calmly, this is actually a deeply human experience. one that is very close to the normal physiology of the brain. Cleveland Clinic describes these hypnagogic experiences as brief hallucinations that happen while a person is drifting into sleep, and says they are common and usually not something to worry about. They also note that as many as 70% of people may experience them at least once in their lives. What is especially interesting is that most of these experiences are visual. People may see geometric patterns, little points of light, bands of colour, rapidly changing shapes, or even brief glimpses of people, animals, or faces. In other words, when consciousness begins to leave behind the sharp and orderly observation style of the daytime, it does not fall straight into total darkness. It often passes through a strange zone of the light, where images have not yet become full dreams, but are no longer deliberate imagination either. That is why some people close their eyes and almost immediately feel as though colours are shifting in front of them, as if the brain is projecting tiny fragments of film just beneath the eyelids. If you have ever lain still and suddenly seen a face flash by, or a strange room appear and disappear before you could really look at it, that does not mean consciousness has already fallen fully into dreaming. In fact, the short and fragmented nature of the experience is exactly what shows that consciousness is standing at a threshold between two worlds. Cleveland Clinic explains this quite clearly. Dreams usually have some kind of storyline, while hypnagogic experiences are more like quick flashes of images or sounds. Scientific review articles describe this region in much the same way. It is not a coherent story, but scattered pieces of perception, sometimes like snapshots, sometimes like half a spoken sentence, sometimes just a very brief sensation. So if daytime consciousness is like a storyteller sitting upright and speaking in complete sentences, then at the edge of sleep, that storyteller begins to tilt into darkness. Speech becomes broken, images slip into the middle of the sentence, and reality is no longer connected in one straight line. This fragmentation is one of the most beautiful signs that consciousness has not disappeared. It is simply changing levels. It is not only images. Sounds can also enter the hypnagogic state in very strange ways. Some people hear a door opening. Some feel as though someone just called their name. Some hear voices, footsteps, knocking, or a sound so hard to describe that even after they are fully awake, it still seems almost too real to dismiss. Cleveland Clinic notes that experiences like these are less common than visual ones, but they are still a clearly recognized part of the hypnagogic state, and auditory experiences can include noises, voices, words, names, or environmental sounds. What matters is that these sounds happen right when consciousness is sliding away from ordinary wakefulness. They are not necessarily signs of illness, and they do not automatically mean the mind is losing control. In many cases, they are simply evidence that when the brain shifts from wake mode into sleep mode, it can create a vivid sense of hearing even when no actual sound is coming from outside the room. That may sound mysterious, but in truth, it is a very natural way to see that consciousness does not only receive the world from outside. Sometimes, at the edge of sleep, it builds an audible world from within. Perhaps no experience startles people more than the feeling of falling just as sleep is beginning. You are drifting very slowly, everything is nearly quiet, and then suddenly there is a quick drop, as if your foot stepped into empty space, as if your body slipped off the edge of some invisible ledge. Right after that comes a sharp jerk, a heartbeat that seems to jump a little. Your eyes may open for a moment and you're back in your bed. Sleep specialists describe this as a sleep start, also known as a hypnic jerk or a sleep onset jerk. These are sudden, brief, strong muscle contractions that happen right at the transition from wakefulness into sleep, and they are generally considered a normal physiological phenomenon. Some review articles also emphasize that they are usually harmless, although they may become more frequent in certain situations such as stress, sleep deprivation, heavy use of stimulants, or excessive fatigue. What makes them so memorable is not only the muscle jerk itself, but the falling sensation that comes with it. At that moment, consciousness is already less firmly anchored to the real body lying in bed, so even a very small change in the way the brain processes bodily signals can turn into the feeling that your whole self has just slipped out of familiar space. And that is exactly why the sensation of falling is not proof that consciousness has completely gone away. It is proof that consciousness is still there, but is learning a different way to feel. If you listen even more closely, you will notice that these jerks also tell us something very deep about consciousness. During the day, consciousness feels fairly certain about where the body is in space. It knows where your feet are, how your arms are resting, that the bed is under your back and that the ceiling is above you. But at the edge of sleep, that certainty begins to blur. The body map in the mind is no longer as sharp as it is while awake, and even a tiny change can create an experience that feels completely real. That is why many people do not only jerk awake, but also feel as though they are falling, floating, sliding, or being pulled for a very brief moment. Cleveland Clinic also notes that bodily experiences in the hypnagogic state can include weightlessness, flying, falling, or the sense that someone is present in the room. That sounds like something from a supernatural story, but the fascinating part is that science does not deny the feeling. Science simply places it in the right context, a consciousness that is changing levels, where awareness of the body and the environment is no longer as stable as it is during the day. In other words, the strange feeling is not outside the story of consciousness, it is the story. Some people have been deeply frightened by experiences like these, especially when they hear what sounds like a voice, see what feels like someone walking past, or sense an unexplained presence in the room. That fear is easy to understand, because our consciousness is used to trusting the eyes, the ears, and bodily sensation. When those senses produce something that feels real, but the outside world does not confirm it, people naturally become unsettled. But this is exactly where one of the most important distinctions appears: the difference between hypnagogic experiences and hallucinations that happen while a person is fully awake. Cleveland Clinic points out that hypnagogic experiences happen while a person is falling asleep and are usually harmless, while hallucinations that appear during the daytime when someone is fully awake, especially if they come with other neurological or psychiatric symptoms, are the kind of thing that deserves more careful medical evaluation. This matters a great deal for someone listening at night because it offers a simple kind of reassurance. What appears for a few seconds at the edge of sleep may feel very strange, but most of the time it does not mean you are losing your grip on reality. It simply means consciousness is changing shape so quickly that even you have not had time to adjust to it yet. And perhaps what makes the hypnagogic state so fascinating is that it stands right between science and human feeling. Science names it, describes it, measures it, and places it within a larger understanding of sleep. But as an experience, it still keeps its own special air of mystery. Imagine someone lying in a quiet room, with night outside the window and only the steady sound of the air conditioner in the background. That person closes their eyes and tries to fall asleep, just like on any other night. Then suddenly a line of bright dots flashes across the mind, followed by an unclear face, then a jerk in the leg, then the feeling that someone just whispered close to the ear. If that story were told in broad daylight, it might sound supernatural. But once we place it in the exact moment of transition from wakefulness to sleep, all the pieces begin to fit together naturally. Consciousness has not disappeared. It is only leaving the familiar processing style of the daytime, and those first fragments of image, sound, and sensation rise like little bubbles to the surface. That is why the hypnagogic state can be seen as the place where consciousness reveals its softest, most changeable, and perhaps even its truest form. Another thing worth telling a listener before sleep is that these experiences are usually brief, fragmented, and unstable. They do not last the way a long dream does. They come quickly and then slip away. That may be why they leave behind more of a floating impression than a clear memory. You may wake from a jerk and remember that you just had some kind of experience, but still not be able to explain it exactly. You remember that it seemed as though you heard a voice, but not the words. You remember that it seemed as though you saw a face, but cannot describe the eyes or the shape. This matches clinical descriptions very well, which say that hypnagogic experiences are often fleeting, disconnected, and low in narrative, unlike dreams, which usually feel more like complete scenes or stories. This is an important detail for the main point of this video, because it shows that consciousness at the edge of sleep is not gone, but has not yet become a full dream either. It is in between. It is like a radio changing frequencies, where the old voice has not completely disappeared and the new one has not fully come through. Some researchers are especially interested in the hypnagogic state, because it may reveal a great deal about how the brain creates conscious experience. When a person is fully awake, consciousness stays tightly attached to the external environment, to tasks, to language, and to logical order. But when a person drifts towards sleep, consciousness becomes more open to spontaneous imagery, unusual bodily sensations, stray pieces of language, and associations that do not need explanation. These changes are not only interesting because they are strange, but because they suggest that the brain has more ways of constructing reality than we often realize. Daytime reality is a very stable coordination among the senses, attention, and memory. The reality of the sleep threshold is a looser coordination, where consciousness no longer prioritizes precision the way it does when fully awake, and seems more willing to let ambiguous signals pass through. That is also why some modern sources describe the hypnagogic state as its own distinct form of consciousness, rather than simply calling it almost a sleep in a casual sense. It is a transition with content, with phenomena, with images, with sensations, and sometimes even with unusual creative or revealing value. Of course, something being normal does not mean it should always be ignored. If someone frequently has hypnagogic experiences that are intensely frightening, long-lasting, or accompanied by excessive daytime sleepiness, sleep paralysis, or other signs of a sleep disorder, then talking with a doctor makes sense. Cleveland Clinic emphasizes that these experiences can happen in completely healthy people, but may also appear more often in certain sleep disorders such as narcolepsy. The National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke also describes vivid images and sensations, sometimes frightening ones, that may occur when a person with narcolepsy is falling asleep or waking up. This does not take away from the fact that hypnagogic experiences are normal for most people. It simply reminds us that context matters. Hearing your name for a moment while you're drifting into sleep is not the same as hearing voices in the middle of the day. A sudden jerk from the sensation of falling at sleep onset is not the same as a pathological seizure. And making those distinctions is exactly what allows the story of consciousness as it sinks into sleep to remain both accurate and gentle. There is also a quiet kind of beauty in knowing that most of these strange experiences are normal, because once we understand that, we no longer have to fight them so hard. If one night you see an unusual flash of light behind your closed eyes, remember that consciousness may simply be changing the way it draws the world. If you hear what seems like a faint sound, remember that at the edge of sleep, the brain can sometimes create sound before it gives you a dream. If you jolt from the feeling of falling, remember that it does not mean you are losing control. It may only mean that for one brief moment, the body and consciousness are no longer moving together in the usual daytime way. This knowledge does not take the mystery out of the night. It only makes that mystery less frightening. And for someone who wants to sleep peacefully, that may be the best gift science can offer. Not to erase the strange beauty completely, but to place it within an order gentle enough that we no longer panic at our own experience. And perhaps if we listen closely enough, we will realize that these strange things at the edge of sleep do not weaken the message of this video at all. They prove it more clearly than anything else. If consciousness truly switched off right away, there would be no brief flashes of light. There would be no vague sound like something from a distant hallway. There would be no falling sensation that lightly pulls us up from the pillow. There would be no figures, faces, patterns, streaks of light, or half-finished little phrases suspended between two states. All of those experiences can only exist because consciousness is still there, still active, but active in a different language. It becomes less logical, less attached to the outside world, more open to inner imagery, and less controlled by the discipline of daytime thought. That is why hypnagogic experiences once felt sacred to people in earlier centuries, and why modern science finds them so worthy of study. They are the place where the boundary between still knowing and beginning to dream becomes visible. They are the moment when consciousness reveals itself while changing clothes. And the strangest thing of all is this: when those first images appear, your consciousness has not disappeared. It simply no longer operates the way it does during the day. So if tonight, while listening to Sleep by Knowledge, your mind briefly shows you a figure, a staircase, a streak of light, an unclear sound, or a very quick sensation of falling through empty space, you do not need to be afraid. It may simply be a sign that you are walking the same path human beings walk every night, the path where consciousness leaves its daytime form so gently that it creates little flashes to let you know the transition has begun. And from that very strange but very normal threshold, the journey of the night will go even deeper into regions where consciousness no longer sees only scattered fragments, but begins weaving them into scenes, feelings, and longer stories in the dark. After those brief flashes of images and sounds at the edge of sleep, what happens next is even quieter, but also much deeper. Consciousness no longer just gives us a few bright fragments and then fades. It begins to change its structure from within. During the day, our consciousness usually moves in a fairly clear order. One thought leads to another. A memory comes with a familiar emotion. A sentence in the mind has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But as sleepiness grows, that very order begins to soften. Research on sleep onset shows that this stage comes with very clear changes in behaviour, physiology, and subjective experience. In everyday life, people usually realise that they have fallen asleep not through machines, but through the feeling that consciousness is no longer operating the way it had just moments before. And right here, the central truth of tonight returns once again. Consciousness does not disappear right away. It begins to crack gently into smaller, softer, less controllable pieces. One of the most interesting findings from research on the onset of sleep is that the feeling of having fallen asleep is strongly linked to two familiar things that we rarely notice: the ability to keep our thoughts logical and the ability to control the flow of our own thinking. Put more simply, when we are awake, we can pull a thought back, adjust it, continue it, argue with it, or set it aside. But when consciousness begins drifting towards sleep, that control weakens. A story in your mind can be moving along normally and then suddenly break off without warning. An idea can appear with no purpose at all. A fragment of an image can slip into a thought as though it no longer needs permission from daytime reason. In one study on subjective experience during sleep onset, the logic of thought and the ability to control thought were two very strong predictors of whether a person felt they were asleep or not. That almost tells us directly that when consciousness enters sleep, the first thing it loses is not the whole self, but the authority to govern the stream of thought in the daytime way. At the same time, what we might call the shared world, the world we all move through during the day with light, voices, objects, clocks and distance, begins to drift farther away. Earlier studies on sleep onset have consistently found that awareness of the surroundings gradually decreases. Awareness of time becomes blurrier and attention turns inward. That's why there are nights when you are still lying in the same room, but your consciousness is no longer truly in that room. It still hears the fan, but the fan is no longer the centre of things. It still knows it is nighttime outside the window, but the night outside no longer matters as much as the night beginning to open inside the mind. This is not a sudden break from reality. It is more like a boat leaving the dock in fog. The dock is still there. The water is still there. It is just that your eyes no longer hold onto the shoreline the way they did before. As consciousness becomes less aware of the surroundings, it does not fall into emptiness. It shifts from the outer world into the inner one. That may be why, at this moment, so many people have a feeling that is strange and familiar at the same time. I am still thinking, but this kind of thinking is already different. You might begin with something simple, like work, remembering a desk, an unanswered email, or a meeting tomorrow morning. Then suddenly, from that desk, consciousness jumps to an old hallway, then a door, then the vague face of someone you cannot identify, and then all of it disappears before you even have time to ask why. Both classic and modern studies of sleep onset show that once sleep begins, thoughts that resemble waking thoughts gradually decrease, while contents that are more dreamlike increase within just a few seconds or minutes. In other words, consciousness no longer tells its story in a straight line. It begins linking pieces of memory, sensation and imagery in a looser, less goal-driven way. If daytime consciousness is like a careful editor, then consciousness at sleep onset is more like someone gathering loose pages in the wind, holding onto a few, dropping a few, and no longer binding them into the same stack. That also helps explain why early sleep experiences are often short, broken, and incomplete. In one study where participants were awakened at different stages of the night, researchers found that each stage of sleep had its own distinct kind of consciousness. In the first very light stage of sleep, people could still report mental content fairly often, but the richness of that content was lower, and their ability to recall what had just happened was also lower than it was while fully awake or during vivid dreaming later in the night. In other words, consciousness here has not vanished, but it is no longer rich in detail in the daytime sense. It is like a sketch that has only just been outlined, not yet shaded in. Something is happening, but it is not stable, not dense, not long enough to become a complete scene. That matters deeply because it shows that the fragmentation of consciousness is not just a poetic phrase. It reflects a change that can actually be observed in the quality of subjective experience itself. And this is one of the beautiful things about sleep science. For a long time, many people believed that conscious experience in sleep only truly appeared during rapid eye movement sleep, when dreams are usually more vivid and more story-like. But studies involving repeated awakenings during the night show that conscious experience does not belong only to that stage. Reportable content can appear in many different stages of sleep. In a study by Francesca Ciclari and her colleagues, participants reported conscious experiences in about 34% of awakenings from non-rapid eye movement sleep and 77% of awakenings from rapid eye movement sleep. In other words, consciousness does not wait for some special part of the night to appear. It keeps changing all night long, sometimes thinner, sometimes fuller, sometimes more thought-like, sometimes more sensation-driven, sometimes poorer in imagery, and sometimes overflowing with it. That makes the journey of the night feel less like a simple door opening and closing, and more like a river with many bends. If we look more closely at the qualities of each stage, the picture becomes even more interesting. In wakefulness, experience tends to be more thought-based, more connected to the self and more reflective. In the first very light stage of sleep, experience begins shifting away from thinking and towards sensing. It becomes less rich, less likely to be retained, and although it has not completely lost reflectiveness, it is no longer as sharp as it is when fully awake. In deeper stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep, experience is usually shorter, poorer, and less often remembered. Then during rapid eye movement sleep, experience becomes richer, longer, more sensation-driven, and usually less reflective. These differences suggest something very simple and very deep. Consciousness is not merely present or absent. It has texture, density, brightness, and different ways of organizing itself at different points in the night. So when we say consciousness is fragmenting, we do not mean it is shattering completely. We only mean that its structure no longer resembles the structure it has during the day. At the beginning of the night, that change often appears as a kind of thought that is no longer fully thought. Researchers have described how, during sleep onset, sensory experience still tends to be mainly visual, while reality testing and thought control gradually decrease. That fits very closely with a feeling many people have had but could never quite put into words. You're no longer reasoning the way you do when awake, but you're not yet fully inside a complete dream story either. It is as if you are floating through fragments of images, fragments of sentences, fragments of memory. A memory of an old kitchen may rise for no reason. A road from childhood may pass through your mind even though you did not think about it all day. A faint sadness may appear without being tied to any specific event. When consciousness loosens its grip on logic and control, memories no longer line up in strict order. They arrive under different kinds of pull, softer, deeper, and sometimes more mysterious. That also fits with a very interesting line of research on dreams and memory. One review on memory, sleep, and dreaming suggests that the experiences people report from sleep directly reflect the memory processes taking place in the brain. In other words, when you see a strange scene in your mind as you are first falling asleep, it is not necessarily meaningless noise. It may be a trace of the brain touching memories, rearranging them, linking them together, or blending them with emotions still lingering from the day. So when consciousness drifts into sleep, it does not fragment only in the sense of breaking apart. It also fragments in the sense of recombining. The separate pieces do not just fall away, they also find one another in new ways. A very real street may appear together with a person who was never part of that memory in waking life. A face from childhood may appear inside the house you live in now. Something that happened earlier that afternoon may slip into a distant scene from many years ago. That is why the flow of consciousness when we are sleepy feels both broken and secretly stitched together at the same time. Recent studies on the memory sources of dreams also show that in a single sleep report, many memory sources can exist together, especially during sleep onset and during rapid eye movement sleep. Fragments from a few hours earlier, memories older than a week, general knowledge not tied to any one event, and even imagined pieces of the future can all enter the sleeping experience together. That means when consciousness begins to fragment, it is not simply malfunctioning. It becomes more permeable to many layers of time at once. A part of today, a part of yesterday, a part of years ago, and a part of tomorrow. may all end up sitting together in an imaginary room you never meant to build. That is why you can lie down with a very practical thought about tomorrow morning, and only a few minutes later find yourself passing through the smell of an old house, the voice of someone you have not thought about in years, or a road only childhood would remember. Consciousness at that point is no longer following a schedule. It is following the hidden connections of memory. There is another detail that makes this region especially memorable. Some studies suggest that even the very earliest stage of sleep may already be involved in either preserving or fading some traces of new memory. One study on memory loss during sleep onset found that repeatedly interrupting the first very light stage of sleep could alter sleep-dependent memory consolidation and promote forgetting. That does not mean everything you think about before sleep will be erased. It only reminds us that even at this very first threshold, the brain is no longer simply recording the world the way it does during the day. It has already begun to select. Some fragments are kept, some are released, some are distorted and blended into other material. That is why the feeling of a thought being there and then suddenly dissolving, the moment you doze off, is not random. It may be a very real sign that consciousness and memory are beginning to trade roles in the dark. If we describe all of this in very simple language, it might sound like this. During the day, consciousness is like a brightly lit house, where each room has a clear purpose and the paths between them are easy to follow. But when sleepiness comes, the lights in the house do not all go out at once. One room darkens first, another still holds a strip of light. The hallway suddenly feels longer. The doors between rooms open in unusual ways. Something from the workroom may suddenly appear in the memory room. An emotion from an old room may drift into the room of images. That is when the language in the mind begins to break apart. You're no longer talking to yourself in the smooth way you were a few minutes earlier. Some sentences do not finish. Some words remain only as echoes. Some scenes appear without needing words at all. And what matters is that people do not always notice this shift right away through their reflective awareness. Subjective experience may have already changed a great deal before we can even put into words the thought that says, "I think I am already falling asleep." That is why people can sometimes feel as though they are still thinking clearly, even though they have already stepped some distance away from the daytime style of consciousness. This is one of the reasons the sleep onset state feels both scientific and quietly mysterious. We think we're still the same storyteller, but in truth, that storyteller has already changed voice, rhythm, and even the order of what will be told. It is no accident that in one repeated awakening study, the first very light stage of sleep was described as having an in-between quality. The estimated duration of mental content was still fairly long, but the richness of detail and the ability to recall it were both low, while reflectiveness was only moderate. This is a kind of half-lit consciousness, not completely gone from itself, but no longer itself in the daytime sense. Hearing that, many people will probably recognize their own nights, in which the mind seemed to be both still talking and already beginning to dream. And that may also be why the memories that appear at the edge of sleep often move us in such a strange way. They do not arrive the way they do when we intentionally try to remember. They do not appear in the order of a story told in waking life. They are more like old pieces of glass catching light in deep water, a schoolyard from long ago, a chair in an old house, the smell of a rainy afternoon from many years back, a loved one you have not thought about in a long time. As consciousness moves into sleep, it seems to become less of a place for analysis and more of a place for receiving. It does not immediately question what appears. It lets images and feelings step forward first. That fits very well with research showing that later sleep experiences tend to lean more towards sensation than thought, and that dreamlike content increases as sleep onset progresses. So if there are moments when you only meant to think about work, but instead find yourself touching a memory from far away, do not assume that you have lost your way. It may simply be consciousness leaving behind the map of the day and stepping into the wider map of the night. The strangest thing, and also the most beautiful, is that all of these scattered pieces do not cancel one another out. They reveal a softer truth about what it means to be human. Our consciousness is not one single, unchanging block from morning to night. It is a living process, changing its rhythm with light, with the body, with memory, with emotion, and with the depth of sleep. During the day, it prefers order. At the beginning of the night, it accepts fragmentation. Later in the night, it may weave those fragments into longer dreams, That means fragmentation here is not a sign of loss. It is a necessary middle step that allows consciousness to leave the shared world and enter its own inner one. Without that loosening, memories would not rise on their own. Images would not bridge moments from vastly different times. We would not have that strange feeling of still thinking, while already having stepped beyond the old way of thought. And right here, everything returns to the same single message. As we gradually sink into sleep, consciousness has not abandoned us. It has simply begun speaking in another language, one with fewer words, more images, softer logic, and deeper layers of memory and feeling slowly stepping forward. As those fragments of images, sounds, and memories begin drifting apart, the brain is also quietly moving deeper into a remarkably orderly architecture of the night. This is where sleep becomes both poetic and scientific at the same time. Beneath the vague feeling of consciousness, the body is actually following a fairly clear map. A normal night of sleep in an adult is not one solid block of darkness. It includes 3 stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep and 1 stage of rapid eye movement sleep, and those stages repeat in cycles several times through the night. One cycle usually lasts about 90 to 110 minutes, and most people move through about 4 to 5 of these cycles in one night. In other words, when we think we're simply sleeping, consciousness is actually being guided through many different climates of the mind. This matters deeply to the central message of tonight's journey, because if consciousness truly disappeared the moment we fell asleep, there would be no need for such a delicate structure. But nature does not choose to shut everything off at once. Nature chooses to move in layers. First comes the very light zone of sleep we just passed through, where consciousness can still hear the world but has already begun to loosen its grip on it. After that comes a more stable, deeper, more even kind of sleep. Then comes deep sleep, where the body sinks down the farthest. Only after that do we reach rapid eye movement sleep, where brain activity becomes more active, and dreams are often more vivid. So one night of sleep is like many layers of ocean resting on top of one another, each with a different colour of water, a different rhythm of breathing, and a different kind of consciousness. Right after that first threshold, most people move into the second stage of non-rapid eye movement sleep. This is the stage that takes up the largest share of sleep in adults. According to specialist materials from the National Library of Medicine, about 75% of human sleep time falls within the non-rapid eye movement stages, and among those, stage 2 takes up the greatest portion. Some sources describe this single stage as making up nearly half of the entire night's sleep. That means if sleep is the great house of the night, then the place where consciousness spends the most time is not the barely open doorway at the beginning, and not the brightest dream near morning, but a middle region that is calmer, steadier, and less dramatic, yet forms the quiet framework of the whole night. This stage is no longer as fragile as the moment when you first begin drifting off. The heart rate slows more, body temperature drops more, the muscles relax more, and the brain begins showing very distinctive electrical patterns that science uses to identify stage 2 sleep. These include brief bursts of activity called sleep spindles and large waves called K-complexes. A listener lying in bed does not need to memorize those names, but we can understand their meaning in a very human way. This is the point when the brain is trying to hold sleep more steadily, as if it has closed the bedroom door a little more firmly, so that consciousness is less likely to be blown backward by drafts from the outside world. Here, consciousness has not disappeared, but it has been placed in a quieter room where the outer world cannot intrude as easily as it could earlier in the night. If you want a clearer picture, imagine that during the day, consciousness is like a person standing in a busy city square, surrounded by voices, light, movement, schedules, names, and goals. In the first stage of sleep, that person has walked away from the square, but can still hear the city in the distance. By the second stage of sleep, that person has entered a quieter house. The city still exists, but it no longer reaches the centre of the room so easily. That is why many people are not as easily awakened by very small disturbances as they are when they first begin drifting off. Consciousness has been wrapped in another layer. It has not completely left the body. It has not completely stopped sensing. But it has clearly become something very different from daytime awareness. And strangely enough, it is in this less dramatic state that one of the most important structures of the night is being built. Not everything important in consciousness happens in bright, dazzling moments. Some of the most important things happen in quiet, steady regions, as gentle and regular as rain in the night. Then, as the night deepens, the brain leads the body and consciousness down into another layer altogether. This is the deepest stage of non-rapid eye movement sleep, often called slow-wave sleep. In this stage, the brain's electrical activity is marked by slow rhythms with large waves. The body is harder to wake, and if someone is awakened from this stage, they may feel groggy, slow, and disoriented for the first few minutes. Specialist sources describe this as the deepest stage of sleep and the one with the highest arousal threshold. If in the earlier stages consciousness was like someone just entering the house, then here it is as if consciousness has gone down into the deepest basement of the night, where everything is heavier, slower, and quieter. The early part of the night usually contains more time in this deep stage, which is why the first hours of sleep are often when the body sinks most powerfully. This is also where many people have had a very particular experience when they are awakened suddenly. The eyes may open, but the mind feels as though it has not quite returned to the world yet. Consciousness seems to arrive a beat behind. That feeling is not random. It reflects the fact that during deep sleep, the connection between consciousness and the shared outer world has been loosened much more. Sensory responses decrease, responsiveness to the environment becomes lower, and the brain is operating in a rhythm very different from wakefulness. That does not mean deep sleep contains no subjective experience at all. Studies that awaken people from different stages of sleep have shown that people can still report mental content even when they are awakened from non-rapid eye movement sleep, including from fairly deep stages. It is just that the content is usually shorter, less visual, and less story-like than the vivid dreams people often have closer to morning. So consciousness does not vanish. It is more like a flame sheltered deep inside glass, still burning but no longer blazing. That is worth remembering, because in popular culture, many people are used to thinking that only rapid eye movement sleep contains dreams. But modern science is much more careful than that. Studies by Francesca Cicleri and her colleagues, along with many others, show that participants can still report conscious experiences after being awakened from non-rapid eye movement sleep. The difference is not that one state contains consciousness and the other is completely empty. The difference is the quality of the experience. Reports from non-rapid eye movement sleep are usually shorter, less vivid, less emotional, or more thought-like than sensory. Reports from rapid eye movement sleep, on the other hand, are usually longer, more visual, more emotional, stranger, and more story-like. That fits perfectly with what we have been following since the beginning of this video. Consciousness does not have just one single form during the night. It changes its texture from one layer of sleep to the next. And then, after the body has passed through the non-rapid eye movement stages, another kind of night begins to open. The first period of rapid eye movement sleep usually appears about 70 to 90 minutes after sleep begins, and then grows longer in later cycles. That is why the final part of the night usually contains more time in this stage than the beginning does. This is one reason so many people find that their clearest, longest, most emotional and most memorable dreams tend to happen closer to morning. It is not that dawn itself brings dreams. It is that the structure of the night has quietly changed the balance of time among the different layers of sleep. The beginning of the night leans more toward deep sleep. The end of the night leans more toward rapid eye movement sleep. So consciousness also changes colour with the passing of the night, like a sky moving from dense black into a fragile blue before sunrise. Rapid eye movement sleep is especially fascinating to both science and human imagination, because here the brain becomes active in ways that resemble wakefulness. Materials from the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute explain very clearly that brain activity measured during this stage shows features similar to brain activity during wakefulness. The eyes may move quickly beneath closed eyelids. Dreams often happen here. At the same time, the muscles of the whole body become deeply relaxed to prevent people from physically acting out their dreams. This loss of muscle tone is a normal feature of rapid eye movement sleep. Without it, vivid dreams could lead to much more real movement in the body. That makes this stage a beautiful kind of paradox. The brain seems to light up, while the body lies still more completely than ever. Put in more familiar terms, this is the point when consciousness seems to stop looking at the outside world and begins building a private world of its own with remarkable conviction. A room can be created with light, depth, faces, heartbeat, and emotion that feel almost indistinguishable from reality. A conversation can unfold as naturally as it would during the day. A fear can feel sharp enough that your heart is still racing when you wake up. A joy can feel warm enough to linger even after the dream is gone. Science explains this not as magic, but by showing that dreams in rapid eye movement sleep are usually longer, more visual, more emotional, and more narrative than experiences taken from other stages. In other words, if consciousness in very light sleep is only releasing scattered fragments, here it has become capable of weaving an entire tapestry. But it would be too simple, and not quite right, to tell the story as though one side is dreaming and the other side is not. The truth is more subtle and much more interesting. Studies using high-density electroencephalography show that dream experiences can occur in both non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. The difference is that the content and tone are often different. In non-rapid eye movement sleep, dream reports are usually shorter, less bizarre, and closer to thinking. In rapid eye movement sleep, they are usually richer in perception, richer in emotion, and more like a story. So we should not say that consciousness only becomes active when the eyes begin moving rapidly. A more accurate way to say it is that consciousness can remain present throughout the night, while changing its style of expression from one stage of sleep to another. That is a truth that is both precise and deeply poetic, because it allows us to see the whole night as one continuous transformation of consciousness, not one blank stretch followed by a sudden return. The more closely we look at a night of sleep, the more it seems that the beginning of the night and the end of the night are like two different lands on the same continent. Early in the night, the body descends more quickly, deep sleep is more abundant, and the feeling of sinking is stronger. This is the time when, if we are awakened, we're more likely to feel mentally heavy, slow to speak, and physically not quite caught up with the moment. Near the end of the night, rapid eye movement sleep lasts longer, so consciousness is more likely to enter vivid scenes, stronger emotions, and more coherent stories. That not only explains why many memorable dreams happen near morning, but also gives us a beautiful image to hold on to. A night of sleep is not one straight line going downward. It is a series of waves that lift and lower consciousness in different ways. Sometimes it sinks deep, sometimes it brightens inside a dream, sometimes it stays in a middle region, quiet as breathing. These differences also make something else clearer. Human awareness is not only stronger or weaker, it also has different qualities. In the first light stage of sleep, awareness is fragile, delicate, half there and half gone. In the more stable stages, awareness is less dramatic but more fully enclosed. In deep sleep, awareness becomes thinner and harder to connect back to the outer world. In rapid eye movement sleep, awareness can become very rich on the inside, even while the body lies motionless. This is exactly why a person can go to sleep with scattered thoughts, pass through the middle of the night in near silence, and then close to morning find themselves living inside a story full of people, colour, and emotion. Consciousness is not contradicting itself. It is simply moving through different modes of the night. From a physiological point of view, this is also beautiful in another way. During rapid eye movement sleep, the body does not regulate temperature as well as it does in other stages, and the muscles become limp to prevent dreams from turning into action. Meanwhile, during non-rapid eye movement sleep, especially deep sleep, the brain shows its characteristic slow rhythms and the body settles into rest in a different way. Put simply, the layers of sleep do not differ only in subjective feeling. They also differ in the way the entire body and brain coordinate with one another. Once we understand that, we can see that consciousness is not something floating above the body. It changes form together with the body, the heart rate, the breathing, the temperature, the muscle tone, the brain's electrical activity, and the biological rhythm of the entire night. That is why one night of sleep can be understood as a performance of the whole body, with consciousness as the central character, but not the only one. If someone were to ask a very simple question at this point, asking where consciousness really is during sleep, the most honest answer would probably be this: it is changing position and changing form all night long. When you first drift off, it is still standing close to the door. During more stable sleep, it has retreated deeper into the house. During deep sleep, it is as if it has gone down to the lowest floor, where the noise of the street can no longer reach it easily. And when vivid dreaming opens, it is as if consciousness is sitting inside a self-made movie theatre, where the light comes from within instead of from the outside world. This way of imagining it is not poetry decorating science. It is a gentle translation of what research on sleep stages and mental content has been showing us. Consciousness is not still, it travels through its own layers, and right here, another wonderful question appears. If consciousness truly vanished completely during sleep, then how could it build an entire dream world by the end of the night, one that feels so vividly real? The question almost answers itself. What we call sleep is not one dark block with no content. It is a process with structure, rhythm, stages, different degrees of separation from the outside world, and different kinds of subjective experience. Dreams do not rise out of absolute emptiness. They grow out of a night that has already been prepared through many steps, many layers, many ways of sinking and rising within consciousness. So the more clearly we understand the real structure of sleep stages, the more we see that the mystery of sleep is not destroyed at all. It is simply placed where it belongs. Sleep is mysterious not because it is impossible to understand, but because it is extraordinarily subtle. Perhaps the gentlest thing this part offers a listener before sleep is the feeling that night is not a single dark cliff that we fall straight down. Night has steps. Some are very shallow, some are very deep, some are still as stone, some are full of images like water. And our consciousness moves through each of those steps in an order that nature has protected for a very long time. Once we understand that, we no longer have to be surprised that the beginning of the night feels so heavy and deep, while the early morning can bring such vivid dreams. We no longer have to choose between the two extremes of completely awake and completely gone. We can accept that throughout the night we are living through many different versions of awareness. Every one of those versions is real. Every one of them is part of what it means to be human. And all of them strengthen the same single message of this journey. As we gradually sink into sleep, consciousness does not disappear. It simply changes form from one layer of the night to the next. And then, after consciousness has passed through the deeper layers of the night, something very strange begins to happen. Instead of disappearing completely, it turns inward and starts building another world. The real ceiling is no longer in front of your eyes. The real room is no longer around you. The ticking clock or the light outside the window no longer holds the center of attention. But in their place, a road can appear, a face can emerge, a conversation can begin, a fear can grow larger, or a joy can warm itself as if it were truly happening. This is the moment when dreams enter the story of consciousness. And dreams are not just the strange pictures of the night. In sleep science, they are understood as a form of conscious experience during sleep, most prominent in rapid eye movement sleep, but not limited to that stage alone. Materials from the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke clearly state that dreaming can occur in every stage of sleep, although it is usually most vivid during rapid eye movement sleep. Recent reviews of consciousness and sleep also show that nearly every awakening from rapid eye movement sleep produces reports with experiential content, while in non-rapid eye movement sleep, that content still appears, but more sparsely and more thinly. That means when we dream, consciousness does not leave us. It simply changes direction. During the day, consciousness clings to the outer world, to light, sound, distance, faces, schedules, and everything that needs to be done. When we dream, consciousness depends less on the outer world and begins taking its material from inside the brain itself. It uses memory, emotion, desire, worry, unfinished things, and even the smallest fragments of life to build a private stage. Science does not describe dreams as emptiness, but as another form of experience created by the sleeping mind. Research on the relationship among dreaming, memory, and sleep shows that dream content reflects memory processing activities taking place in the brain. So a dream is not just random imagery. It is often a trace of the brain working with pieces of real life, only doing it in a way that is softer, looser, and freer than it is during the day. That may be why dreams can feel convincing in such a strange way. Your body is still lying quietly in bed, but in a dream you may run through a forest, sit on a train, meet a loved one who is far away, or stand inside a house that does not exist and still feel as though you belong there. Materials on sleep physiology explain that during rapid eye movement sleep, the brain operates in ways that resemble wakefulness in many respects. while the voluntary muscles of the body enter a temporary state of paralysis to reduce the chance of physically acting out the dream. It is a beautiful paradox. The brain lights up while the body remains still. Because of that mechanism, consciousness can sink deeply into an inner world without forcing the body to follow along. So when a dream creates a scene that feels intensely vivid, that is not some miracle outside science. It is a very real ability of the sleeping brain to generate a subjective reality filled with depth, sensation, and emotion, even while the body remains almost motionless. And because dreaming is a form of conscious experience, it is not emotionally empty. In fact, dreams are often surprisingly full of emotion. One review on the emotional function of dreams suggests that dreaming may be involved in emotional regulation, while educational material from the National Institutes of Health explains that sleep, especially rapid eye movement sleep, helps process emotional memories and may reduce their emotional intensity afterward. Research on responses to dream content also shows that the dreamer's emotional reactions to people and events in dreams are often very similar to the reactions that person might have in waking life. That helps explain why a dream that is only an image in the mind can still wake you up with heaviness in your chest, tears in your eyes, or your heart still racing. Consciousness in dreams no longer clings to the outer world, but it still knows how to fear, to remember, to regret, to long for, and to rejoice. That is exactly why dreams can carry such real psychological weight. Dreams become even more interesting when we look at them from the perspective of memory. An article from the National Institutes of Health on sleep and memory describes sleep as a special time when the brain returns to the memories newly formed during the day, deciding what should be kept and what can be let go. Deep sleep seems to help stabilize memory, while rapid eye movement sleep seems to help connect related memories, sometimes in very surprising ways. That is why a full night of sleep can sometimes help people see a problem more clearly the next morning, or suddenly make scattered pieces fall into place. In the language of tonight's journey, when consciousness stops clinging to the outer world, it does not fall into meaningless emptiness. It steps into a hidden workshop where memories are rearranged, strengthened, linked to other memories, and sometimes woven into lines of association that are harder to see in daylight. That also helps explain why dreams so often draw their material from very ordinary things. Dreams do not always use grand events or major upheavals. Sometimes they borrow a tiny piece of conversation, a face that passed by during the day, a street corner you just walked through, an email you just read, or a small worry you had not even fully named yet. In the history of dream research, the idea of day residue has been used for a very long time to describe the presence of recent experience inside dream content. Modern reviews still find this effect very significant. One study on the memory sources of dreams found that traces of recently experienced events appear quite often in dreams, especially in sleep stages closer to the beginning of the night, while older memories tend to contribute more often to dreams during rapid eye movement sleep. That means dreams do not only draw from today, they also reach down into deeper layers of life. So something that barely brushed past you during the day can become an entire story at night. You may only think briefly of someone from your past after catching a familiar scent, and then that night the person appears in a long dream with a train platform, light rain, words never spoken in real life, and a very real feeling of regret. You may only feel slightly tense about a meeting tomorrow morning, and by night that tension has been woven into a dream full of long hallways, papers flying through the air, clocks with no clear numbers, and the feeling of always being one step behind. Science on memory and dreaming does not treat those scenes as completely random. They fit the idea that dreams reflect the brain's processing of new memories, old memories, and the emotional links between them. Consciousness in dreams is both familiar and strange. It uses the real objects of your life but arranges them in a way that only the night can. If we only look at the surface, dreams can sometimes seem irrational. A high school friend may appear in the house you live in now. A loved one who has died may speak in the voice of someone you saw yesterday. Now, a place you have never been may feel more familiar than the places you know in real life. But what is fascinating is that while the logic of events in dreams is often loose, the emotional logic is often very precise. Research on responses to dream content shows that people's emotional reactions in dreams are often continuous with the reactions they have in waking life. In other words, a dream may be wrong about the place, wrong about the time, wrong about the roles people play, but very right about the worry, longing, love, or tension underneath it. That is why a strange dream can still touch us so deeply. Consciousness in dreams is not trying to build a world that is logical by the standards of daytime science. It is building a world that is truer to emotion, and that emotional accuracy is what makes dreams feel so real. That is also why some dreams seem to understand us more deeply than words do. During the day, many emotions are covered over by busyness, manners, habit, and the need to focus on work. But in sleep, those coverings grow weaker. A review published in 2024 on the role of dreaming in emotional memory suggests that dreaming may be involved in both memory consolidation and the emotional regulation of those memories. That is a beautiful idea in the larger journey of consciousness. When it no longer has to face outward, consciousness can turn inward and touch what has not yet settled. A small sadness from the afternoon may become a dream that feels larger than the feeling itself. A quiet hope may turn into a radiant encounter. A mild anxiety may be amplified into a fast-moving scene. Dreams do not always tell the truth in a literal sense, but they often touch emotional truth in a way that is hard to deny. One of the things that fascinates people most about dreams is the brain's ability to create a whole world with depth and texture without direct data from the outside world. You're not actually looking at the ocean, and yet in a dream you may still hear waves, feel wind, and smell salt. No one is speaking outside your room, and yet in a dream you may still hear words that leave you breathless. That is not evidence that dreams come from some realm outside the brain. It is evidence that the human brain has an extraordinary ability to generate rich subjective experience from what it has already stored inside itself. Materials from the National Library of Medicine emphasize that when people are awakened from rapid eye movement sleep, they often report dreams that are long, vivid, emotional, and almost hallucinatory in quality. If daytime consciousness needs the world to create experience, then in dreams, consciousness can temporarily do that work on its own, using its own internal storehouse of material. Because dreams can connect related memories in unexpected ways, they have long been associated with the feeling of waking up with a new idea. An article from the National Institutes of Health explains clearly that linking related memories during rapid eye movement sleep is one reason why getting enough sleep can support problem solving. That does not mean every dream is a prophecy, or that every image carries some hidden universal message. But it does suggest that when consciousness leaves behind the straight-line thinking of the day, it may allow distant connections to meet more easily. A melody heard in passing, a sentence not fully understood, a longing that never found words, a problem that felt stuck, all of it can be placed side by side during the night. Sometimes we wake up without remembering the dream clearly, yet still feel that something inside us has been rearranged. That is one of the gentlest things about dreams. They do not only tell stories, they also quietly work with the stories we carry. And then there are those nights when, in the middle of everything feeling completely real, you suddenly realize that you are dreaming. This is the special phenomenon known as lucid dreaming. Scientific reviews describe lucid dreaming as a state in which the dreamer becomes aware that they are dreaming, and this happens mostly during rapid eye movement sleep. This matters deeply to the story of consciousness because it shows that on some nights, even while consciousness is immersed in a world created by itself, a part of reflective awareness can still light up. Not brightly enough to wake fully, but enough to whisper very softly, "This is a dream." That makes lucid dreaming one of the most compelling pieces of evidence that consciousness during sleep is not one single uniform thing. It can be absorbed in the dream and at the same time observe the dream. What draws scientific attention to this phenomenon is not only that it is strange, but that it has been verified through signals that can actually be recorded. For decades, researchers have taken advantage of one feature of rapid eye movement sleep. The eyes can still move beneath closed eyelids. They asked dreamers that if they became lucid in a dream, they should signal it with a prearranged pattern of eye movements. Scientific reviews of lucid dreaming describe this method as a major milestone, because it turned an experience that seemed completely private into something that could be studied experimentally. That means lucid dreaming is not just a mysterious anecdote. It is a phenomenon that science has found a way to identify in the laboratory. And when we remember that, the main message of tonight grows even clearer. Consciousness in sleep is not simple at all. It can dream, know that it is dreaming, and even send a signal out to the outside world through the eye movements the sleeping body still allows. Even so, lucid dreaming is not a constant state, and it is not something everyone experiences often. Most nights still pass through ordinary dreaming, when we fully believe in the world unfolding before us. And there is something lovely about that too, because it shows that consciousness does not always need to step back and watch itself. Sometimes it only needs to live inside the scene that night has built. But now and then that reflective capacity glows a little, like a small lamp in the fog, and we have the rare experience of being inside the dream while also knowing it is a dream. It is a fragile balance between immersion and awareness, between surrender and observation. And that balance highlights a deeper truth. Dreaming is not the loss of consciousness, it is a variation of consciousness. It is also worth saying gently but clearly that dreams should not be turned into predictions or used as a tool for careless interpretation. Current science does not support the idea that every image in a dream has one fixed code that can be decoded into a universal meaning for everyone. But science does strongly support something more subtle. Dreams are connected to memory, emotion, recent events, more distant connections in life, and the way the brain processes information during sleep. So what makes dreams worth cherishing is not that they predict the future, but that they show how rich the brain and consciousness really are when they stop looking outward and turn inward. A dream may not be a prophecy, but it can absolutely be a small window into the way the mind is reorganizing its inner life. And if by now we wonder why some dreams feel both strange and deeply fitting, the answer may be that they do not serve the logic of the outside world. They serve the logic of emotion and association in the inner world. A train may never pass through your childhood home in waking life, but in a dream that is perfectly possible if the feeling attached to both places belongs to the same current of memory. A living person may speak in the voice of someone who has died if what the dream wants to preserve is not exact identity, but the feeling of hearing that familiar voice again. Dreams are often not faithful to the geography of real life, but they are faithful to the emotional map of consciousness. That is why they are both strange and convincing. They are wrong in a way that feels deeply right. At the beginning of the night, when deep sleep stages are more dominant, dreams and mental experiences are often shorter, thinner, and less richly visual. Near the end of the night, when rapid eye movement sleep grows longer, dreams often become longer, clearer, more emotional, and easier to remember. That is why so many people wake up near dawn with a dream that feels complete in the mind, as if they have truly returned from somewhere they actually visited. This structure of the night also makes dreaming one of the most rhythmic parts of consciousness. It does not appear randomly. It grows gradually according to the architecture of sleep itself. And once we understand that, we begin to see that a night of sleep is not a period of losing ourselves, but a journey through many different versions of inner presence. So if one day you wake up carrying a dream that still leaves your heart gently swaying, remember that it is not meaningless at all. During the night, your consciousness may have touched a memory formed only yesterday, linked it to something from many years ago, passed it through a layer of unfinished emotion, and then built a story that is both unreal and deeply real. The brain did all of that while your body lay still, and that is exactly what makes dreams the most moving part of the story of consciousness as it sinks into sleep. When it no longer clings to the outside world, consciousness does not dissolve. It turns inward and begins telling itself its own story through images, memory, emotion, and scenes that could never exist in waking life and yet still touch the truth of inner life. But if dreams are only illusions, why can the emotions inside them feel so real that your heart is still racing when you wake up? Perhaps because throughout this entire journey, consciousness has never truly disappeared. It has only changed what it holds on to, changed the material it uses to tell its story, and changed the way it feels. When awake, it leans on the outside world. When dreaming, it leans on memory, emotion, and deeper networks of connection inside the brain. So dreams may not be real in a physical sense, but they are very real as experience. And that reality is the gentlest proof of all that consciousness does not switch off in the night. It simply turns inward and lights up another sky. And once dreams have shown us that consciousness can build an entire world from within, we arrive at a place that is even more confusing. These are the in-between moments when a person is not fully awake, but also not fully asleep in the way we usually imagine. Some people wake up in the morning absolutely convinced that they barely slept at all, even though their physical signs show that the body really did pass through multiple stages of sleep during the night. Some lie completely still, clearly aware of the room around them, knowing that they are waking up yet unable to move even a finger. Some are deep inside a dream that feels completely real and suddenly know with certainty that it is a dream, but still do not wake up. These states sound like contradictions, but they tell us something very important about consciousness. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness is not as sharp as we tend to think. In research on dissociated states related to sleep, scientists have repeatedly emphasized that there are moments when features of sleep and features of wakefulness can appear together in a single experience. In other words, consciousness does not have only two settings, on and off. It has half-lit regions, where both sides still overlap. One of the strongest examples of that is the feeling of I did not sleep at all, even though the body actually did sleep. In sleep medicine, the mismatch between subjective sleep experience and objective measurements of sleep has been recognized for a long time, especially in people with insomnia. Many studies show that some people estimate their time to fall asleep as longer than it really was, and their total sleep time as shorter than it really was. Put in very ordinary terms, their consciousness tells the story of a night that was almost entirely tossing and turning, while the body shows that real periods of sleep did happen. That does not mean the person is making up the feeling. It only means that conscious experience does not always line up perfectly with what the brain and body are actually doing through the night. And that gap is what makes the story of consciousness even deeper. Because if consciousness were a perfect mirror, there would be no nights when a person sincerely believes they stayed awake the whole time while also having truly slept for many stretches. But consciousness is not a perfect measuring device. It is a lived experience from the inside, and sometimes that experience is softer, more blurred, and more interpretive than the body's objective physiological signals. This becomes even more striking when studies of older adults also find the same kind of mismatch between perceived sleep and measured sleep. That does not mean we should turn sleep into some cold mathematical problem. It simply helps the listener understand something gentle. If you have had nights when you lay there feeling half awake the entire time, never truly sleeping, that feeling is real at the level of experience. But it does not necessarily tell the whole physiological truth of what your body was doing that night. It may be that your consciousness held onto a prolonged sense of being present, while the rest of your nervous system slipped many times through light stages of sleep and then rose back up. That makes the night into a very strange place. We may have slept and still felt awake. And that paradox is beautiful evidence that consciousness does not disappear or return along one sharp dividing line. It can remain like an echo, even when the body has gone farther than we realize. If the state of being asleep but thinking you're awake shows that consciousness sometimes tells the story of the night in its own way, then sleep paralysis shows even more clearly how the features of sleep and wakefulness can overlap. In medical language, this state is called sleep paralysis, meaning paralysis that happens while falling asleep or waking up. Medical reviews describe it as a state that occurs when a person is either drifting into sleep or just emerging from it, in which they cannot move or speak normally, yet still have some degree of awareness. Many people say they know very clearly that they are lying in bed, know the room around them, know they are trying to move, but the body does not respond. Some also feel intense fear because the experience can come with pressure on the chest, mild difficulty breathing, or the sense that some presence is in the room. From a scientific point of view, this is not some strange force entering the night. It is a dissociated state, where the muscle paralysis that belongs to rapid eye movement sleep extends into the moment when consciousness has already risen close to wakefulness. In other words, the body is still holding on to one feature of sleep while consciousness has already regained part of wakefulness. What makes that state so frightening is not only being unable to move, but the feeling of being awake while trapped inside a body that has not caught up yet. Many reports describe the combination of immobility, clear awareness, and intense sensations such as someone being present, pressure on the chest, a figure in the corner of the room, or strange sounds. Reviews of sleep paralysis emphasize that vivid hallucinations can accompany this state, and that the combination of awareness and immobility makes people easy to interpret it in supernatural ways if they do not know the sleep physiology behind it. interpreted. But once we understand that this is the carryover of the muscle atonia of rapid eye movement sleep into the moment of waking or falling asleep, it no longer feels like an unexplainable story. It is still mysterious at the level of sensation, but not nameless at the level of mechanism. And that is where the greatest reassurance lies. Something strange can feel completely real while it is happening, and still belong to a biological language the human body has carried for a very long time. In fact, because sleep paralysis is so intense at the level of experience, it has been interpreted through many different cultural lenses all over the world. Reviews of the history and culture of this phenomenon describe how many societies connected it to demons, restless spirits, curses, night pressing, or some supernatural presence sitting on the chest of the sleeper. From Japan to Nigeria to Turkey and many other places, the phenomenon has been wrapped in very different stories, yet the core experience remains astonishingly similar. The person is lying there, aware that they are present, feeling pinned down, unable to move, often overwhelmed by fear, and sensing some unclear presence nearby. This is fascinating because it shows how one biological phenomenon can be retold as many different myths across cultures. Science does not mock those myths. It simply says that underneath them is a real phenomenon at the border between sleep and wakefulness. In that way, the mystery of the night is not erased. It is only illuminated by another layer of understanding. If we look at it gently, sleep paralysis also tells us something very deep about consciousness. During the day, we assume that once awareness returns, the body should follow immediately. But this phenomenon shows that it does not always happen that way. Consciousness may rise first, while the body is still held inside the rules of a sleep state. The inner eyes may already be open while the voluntary muscles remain still, as though sleep has not fully withdrawn yet. That feeling of, I am lying here, I know what is around me, but I cannot move, becomes one of the strongest illustrations of the theme of this video. It proves that sleep and wakefulness are not two completely sealed rooms. There are hallways connecting them. Consciousness can move ahead of the body a little. The body can still keep the characteristics of sleep even after awareness has returned. And that tiny mismatch creates one of the strangest experiences a person can have in the night. Still, it is important to say that not everyone who experiences sleep paralysis has a serious medical problem. Clinical reviews note that the phenomenon is fairly common at the level of happening at least once in a lifetime, while the recurring form that causes significant distress is what deserves more attention. Some studies suggest that sleep paralysis has occurred in a meaningful portion of the general population, while the recurring type is more likely to come with heavier psychological burden or be linked to other sleep problems. Saying that is not meant to minimize the fear of someone who has gone through it. It is meant to place the experience where it belongs. If you have ever woken up, known you were in bed, felt as if some darkness was pressing on your chest, and only a few seconds later could finally move again, that fear was completely real. But it does not necessarily mean you encountered something supernatural or lost your mind. Most likely you passed through one of those in-between regions that sleep medicine has described quite clearly. At the other end of that in-between territory is a state that almost seems like its opposite. If sleep paralysis is the moment when consciousness wakes up but the body still holds on to the immobility of sleep, then lucid dreaming is the moment when awareness lights up inside the dream itself. Reviews in cognitive neuroscience describe lucid dreaming as the phenomenon in which the dreamer realizes that they are dreaming while the dream continues. This state is recorded mostly during rapid eye movement sleep, and researchers have been able to confirm it through the use of prearranged eye movement signals. That means there are moments in the night when one reflective part of human awareness stays bright enough to say, this is not waking life. This is a dream, while the full dream scene still surrounds the person. Once again, this becomes evidence that consciousness is not simply on or off. It can exist inside a world built by the brain and observe that same world from within. What makes lucid dreaming so fascinating is not only that it is rare and beautiful, but the way it pulls the two sides of consciousness closer together. In an ordinary dream, the dreamer usually believes in whatever is happening. They live inside it, react to it, fear it, or rejoice in it. But in a lucid dream, a reflective layer of wakefulness appears inside the dream. The dreamer may still be walking through a city that does not exist, still hearing voices, still seeing a strange sky, and yet at the same time know that all of it belongs to the dream. Some people realize it only for a few seconds before waking up. Others can stay there longer and may even influence the direction of the dream to some degree. From the perspective of tonight's theme, this is a deeply meaningful discovery. It shows that consciousness in sleep is not extinguished and then turned back on only in the morning. It can light up in many different ways during the night, sometimes so deep inside the dream that it forgets itself, and other times awake enough to know it is dreaming without leaving sleep at all. If we place sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming side by side, they look like two mirrors reflecting the same truth. On one side, the body is still under the rules of sleep while consciousness moves closer to wakefulness. On the other side, waking awareness flashes up inside the rules of dreaming. One frightens people because they feel trapped inside immobility. The other astonishes people because they can recognize and sometimes even guide the dream. But both show that the borders between states are not rigid at all. They are hybrid states, where the characteristics of sleep and wakefulness coexist for a brief time. Recent reviews of sleep paralysis and lucid dreaming even place them within the same conceptual framework as border zone states of consciousness, linked to rapid eye movement sleep but involving a higher degree of awareness than ordinary dreaming. That is a beautiful way to describe the journey of consciousness. The night does not consist only of separate rooms, it also has thresholds where the light from one room spills into another. There is another kind of in-between state that is gentler, more familiar, and less often named. It is the moment when you have just woken up, but consciousness is still stuck to the dream, or when you're still dreaming and a signal from the outside world begins to slip in. You may hear an alarm clock enter the dreamer's church bells. You may sense light through the window while still being halfway down a dream road in your mind. You may open your eyes, yet the emotional tone of the dream stays with you for another few seconds. These states are less intense than sleep paralysis and less unusual than lucid dreaming, but they also remind us that the return of daytime consciousness is not always instant. Sometimes the dream leaves first, sometimes the emotion of the dream lingers longer. Sometimes a fragment of the scene still hangs in the mind while the body is already sat up. These moments are soft and brief, and because of that they are often ignored. But if we listen closely, we can see that they are also small pieces of evidence for the same truth. Consciousness moves through thresholds in the night. It does not jump in one straight line. Perhaps what makes these in-between states so haunting is that they shake our habit of simplifying things. We like to believe that we're either awake or asleep. We like clear labels because they give us a sense of control, but the deeper sleep science goes, the more it shows that the brain does not operate entirely like two switches. At the same moment, different parts of the nervous system can display the characteristics of different states. That's why researchers speak of dissociated sleep-related states. Put simply, the night sometimes reveals that the layers of consciousness and the body do not always change state in perfect synchrony. One layer withdraws more slowly, another wakes up more quickly. One layer is still inside the dream while another has already become reflective. And that lack of synchrony is exactly what gives rise to experiences people remember for the rest of their lives. What makes this understanding so valuable is that it does not erase the mystery of the night. In fact, it makes that mystery feel more human. Instead of fearing that we have stepped into something impossible to understand, we can recognize that we have touched the edge of consciousness, where the laws of the night still cover the body, while awareness is already trying to open its eyes, or where reflective thought has lit up before the dream has fully faded. Understanding that does not make the experience dry or mechanical. It only replaces panic with a calmer kind of wonder. If you have ever found yourself unable to move even though you knew you were lying in bed, or have ever suddenly thought inside a dream, "Oh, I am dreaming," then you do not need to see that as some bizarre break inside yourself. Most likely, you are simply seeing more clearly than most people one feature that quietly exists in every night of sleep. Consciousness is a continuous stream, with blurred regions, mixed regions, and overlapping regions. And because of that, the most compelling part of these states may be the reassurance they can offer. People who have gone through sleep paralysis often fear that it will happen again because they remember the helplessness. People who have had nights of sleeping while feeling awake worry that they never truly slept enough. People who have had lucid dreams sometimes feel confused about what the experience says about them. But if we place all of this back inside the larger picture of sleep, we can see them with less heaviness. They are all reminders that during the night, consciousness does not vanish and return like an electric switch. It drifts across many shores. Sometimes it moves more slowly than the body, Sometimes it moves ahead of the body. Sometimes it recognizes itself inside a scene that is not physically real. Sometimes it holds on to the feeling of wakefulness even though the body has already fallen asleep. And all of that is not meaningless chaos. It is variation within the same great process of transformation. So if tonight the listener of Sleep by Knowledge carries away only one idea from this in-between region, let it be this. Human consciousness is not a light bulb that is only on or off. It is more like water. Sometimes the surface is calm and reflects clearly. Sometimes the water darkens. Sometimes waves from two directions meet and create very strange shapes. Sometimes moonlight still lingers on the water, even though morning is almost here. The nights when we think we did not sleep even though we did. The moments of sleep paralysis, the dreams that know they are dreams, and the moments when we wake up but still feel half inside the dream, all belong to those meeting points. And if we can look at them not as threats, but as evidence that consciousness is more flexible than we once believed, then the night will feel less like something to battle and more like a place to listen to the way the human mind changes form in silence. And perhaps by now, after moving through those delicate thresholds of sleep, those flickering fragments of imagery, those vivid dreams and those hard-to-name states in between, we have finally arrived at the most important question of all. Why does the transformation of consciousness during sleep matter so much? Why does nature not simply let us switch off for a few hours and then turn back on the next morning? The answer seems to lie here. Sleep is not only rest. Sleep is the time when the brain quietly carries out enormous work for memory, for emotion, for learning, for recovery, and perhaps even for the feeling that we are still ourselves when tomorrow comes. The National Institutes of Health explains very clearly that sleep before learning helps prepare the brain to form new memories, while sleep after learning is necessary to preserve and strengthen what has just been learned. The same source explains that when sleep is lacking, the ability to learn new things can drop sharply, in part because the hippocampus, which is crucial for forming new memories, functions less effectively. In other words, our daytime consciousness does not use sleep only as a place to rest. It uses sleep as a workshop of repair and reordering, where everything we live, learn and feel is quietly processed again. When we think of it that way, we begin to see that a day of living and a night of sleep are not truly separate from one another. During the day, consciousness opens outward to receive the world. It sees, hears, learns, remembers, carries stress, feels joy, sadness, hope, and worry. But at night, precisely when consciousness grows dimmer on the surface, the brain begins a quieter kind of work. The National Institutes of Health describes how, during sleep, the brain returns to recent memories and seems to decide what should be kept, what can be let go, and what should be connected to other memories. Memories of a skill, such as a sequence of movements or a melody, may even improve after sleep. There is something beautiful in that because it shows that when our consciousness grows dim, the brain does not stop working. Quite the opposite. It is doing the work that will help consciousness become clearer the next day. So sleep is not lost time. It is invested time. It is like the silence between two movements of music, the moment when the listener thinks nothing is happening, even though the orchestra is drawing breath so the song can continue in full. What is even more fascinating is that not every part of sleep does the same job in the same way. The National Institutes of Health explains that deeper stages of sleep seem to make memories more stable, while rapid eye movement sleep seems to help link related memories together, sometimes in surprising ways, and also takes part in processing emotional memories. Specialist materials from the National Library of Medicine also emphasize that a normal night of sleep moves through many cycles, with the earlier part of the night containing more deep sleep and the later part containing more rapid eye movement sleep. So a night of sleep is not only a matter of sleeping longer or sleeping less. It is a sequence of different kinds of work, each with its own role. One part is like an archive. One part is like a workshop of connections. One part is like a room for emotional processing. And if any one of those parts is repeatedly cut short, then the next morning our consciousness may still be awake, but it will not have been restored as fully as it normally would. Many people have probably noticed this in very ordinary ways. After several bad nights in a row, memory starts to feel less reliable. Names are harder to recall. You walk into the next room and forget what you meant to do. Something you studied the day before no longer feels secure in your mind. Those things are not imaginary. An article from the National Institutes of Health on sleep and memory emphasises that sleep both before learning and after learning matters, and that too little sleep significantly reduces the ability to learn something new. This becomes especially important for older adults, because the same source notes that deep sleep tends to decline from the late 30s onward, and that this decline is linked to greater difficulty remembering things the next day in older adults. Put very gently, it means this: memory does not only need time in the light in order to be formed, it also needs darkness in order to be kept. If the light of day is where memory is planted, then nighttime sleep is where it takes root. But sleep does not work only on memory. It also works on emotion, and that may be the part most people feel most clearly in daily life. A restless night can make the next morning feel much more fragile. A small remark can irritate us more easily. An ordinary task can feel heavier than it should. A sadness that was far away can suddenly feel close again. Research reviews on insomnia and sleep deprivation show that lack of sleep increases negative emotion and reduces positive emotion, while also making emotional regulation more difficult. Some neuroscience studies also show that sleep deprivation is associated with stronger responses in the amygdala and weaker regulatory control from the prefrontal cortex. In more familiar language, that means that when we do not sleep enough, the braking system of emotion grows weaker, while the part that flares up emotionally becomes easier to trigger. So our daytime consciousness does not only need sleep in order to remember clearly, it also needs sleep in order to stay soft where softness is needed, calm when calm is needed, and not be pulled too far by every emotional signal. This is where a very deep truth begins to emerge. When consciousness turns inward during sleep and dreams, it is not doing so only to entertain the night. It may be part of the way the brain processes emotions that daytime never fully had the chance to digest. The National Institutes of Health writes that rapid eye movement sleep helps process emotional memories and may reduce the intensity of those emotions afterward. Reviews on the emotional function of sleep also suggest that sleep is a time of repair for adaptive emotional processing. So when a mild daytime worry becomes a dream that feels much more emotionally intense at night, that does not necessarily mean you are weak or being swept away for no reason. It may simply mean the brain is doing what it has always done, taking emotion into another space in order to work through it, away from the noise of the outer world. Dreams, then, are not merely phantom images. They may be part of a healing night, where consciousness no longer faces life directly, but still works with what life has left behind inside it. When we look at sleep from the perspective of learning and creativity, it becomes even more remarkable. The National Institutes of Health notes that a full night of sleep helps build connections between different pieces of information, and for that reason can sometimes support problem solving. A review on PubMed Central also shows that memory processing during sleep not only helps protect memories from fading, but also supports problem solving, creativity, and emotional regulation. That helps explain why something that felt completely stuck the night before may feel less stuck the next morning, even though in between we did not consciously try to think it through any further. In fact, it may be precisely because we stopped trying that the brain finally had the chance to reorganize deeper connections. When consciousness withdraws from the outside world, it does not become useless. It enters another mode, one in which distant connections can meet more easily. That is why sleep is not only rest after a day of work. Sleep is also the way the brain quietly continues working in a more hidden, deeper, and sometimes even wiser way than when we are forcefully trying to think. Then there is another story, very quiet and very large, and that is the story of recovery. For many years, scientists have tried to understand why lack of sleep makes reasoning, attention, mood, and the body itself more vulnerable to problems. One influential line of research came from experiments in mice, which the National Institutes of Health highlighted in 2013. That research showed that during sleep, cerebrospinal fluid moves through channels around blood vessels to help clear away substances that build up in the brain, including beta amyloid. That same source emphasized that this was very strong evidence in mice that sleep may help the brain wash away some of the waste that accumulates during wakefulness. It is important to keep the caution that science requires. that classic evidence came from animals, so it should not be overstated as if every detail has already been fully confirmed in humans. But it is also very important that in 2024, the National Institutes of Health reported a study demonstrating the existence of the principle of cerebrospinal fluid channels along perivascular spaces in living humans, and that same article noted that other studies suggest this system may be more active during sleep. Put fairly and beautifully, science is gradually showing that sleep is not simply shutting down. It may also be part of the brain's maintenance work. If we describe that in everyday language, we might imagine the brain during the day as a city that never stops moving. There are vehicles, noise, roads, opening and closing, and one task after another. When night comes, the city does not collapse. It changes over to the night shift. The road crews begin their work. The storage rooms are reorganized. Unneeded material is carried away. The parts that need repair are repaired. This is only an image, but it helps us feel a real truth. When our surface consciousness darkens, there may still be ongoing work underneath that keeps everything going. That is why after several poor nights of sleep, people do not only feel sleepy, they also feel slower, less attentive, more error-prone, and more emotionally reactive. In the National Institutes of Health article How Sleep Clears the Brain, it is also noted that lack of sleep weakens reasoning, problem-solving, and attention to detail. All of this makes sleep something that restores the qualities of daytime consciousness through many pathways at once: memory, emotion, alertness, and the ability to keep the mind clear. Another very important part of this story is circadian rhythm, the inner clock that quietly coordinates with light and darkness to help decide when consciousness is more ready to drift into sleep and when it is more ready to wake. The National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute explains that when light entering the eyes signals to the brain whether it is day or night, the brain adjusts the production and release of melatonin. Melatonin rises in the evening and peaks in the early morning, helping promote sleep. As light increases, such as when the sun rises, the body increases cortisol to prepare for waking. That same source also emphasizes that strong artificial light late in the evening can interfere with that process and make it harder to fall asleep. That helps explain why many people can feel extremely tired and still struggle to let their minds drift into sleep after spending too long in front of a bright screen. It is not that consciousness is mysteriously stubborn. It is that we are sending daytime signals at the very moment the body needs to be told that it is night. So consciousness does not depend only on willpower. It also listens to the rhythm of light that nature and the environment send into the body each day. When circadian rhythm is disrupted, everything else can be thrown off as well. People who work night shifts, travel frequently across time zones, or stay up very late under strong light often find it harder to fall asleep and harder to wake at the right time. The National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute explains that when the body's central clock does not match the actual sleep schedule, problems can arise in the sleep-wake cycle. This matters a great deal for the subject of consciousness. Consciousness does not enter the night in complete freedom. It does so through cooperation among the pressure to sleep that builds up the longer we stay awake, the gradual rise of adenosine in the brain, and the biological clock shaped by light. If any one of those factors is pulled out of alignment, consciousness becomes harder to release, harder to let drift, and can remain stuck in an unpleasant state that is half awake and half exhausted. So when we look back across the entire journey of this video, we see that sleep is the meeting place between the inner contents of consciousness and the biological rhythms of the whole body. Neither one acts alone, and here we arrive at the final point, which may also be the deepest. Why can sleep affect the feeling of who we are? Science does not say in a simplistic way that one poor night of sleep turns you into another person, but science does show that memory, emotion, attention, learning, and internal regulation all depend heavily on sleep. At the same time, research on autobiographical memory emphasizes that our personal memories give us a continuous sense of self across time. When we place those two things together, a very reasonable conclusion appears. Because sleep helps organize memory and regulate emotion, it also helps preserve the continuity of the feeling that I am still myself. This is an inference, not an absolute slogan, but it fits deeply with lived experience. After several poor nights of sleep, many people do not only feel tired, they feel more irritable than usual, more forgetful than usual, less like the familiar version of themselves than usual. That daytime self is not created by willpower alone. It is supported by memory that has been properly organized, emotion that has been gently regulated, and a brain that has been restored overnight. Perhaps this is the gentlest gift sleep science offers us. It reminds us that each night, when consciousness grows dim, we're not losing ourselves. It may be that this is precisely when the brain is doing the work that helps us return as ourselves the next morning. It keeps what needs to be kept, softens what needs to be softened, connects what needs to be connected, lets go of what should be released, and at the same time follows the rhythm of darkness and light to guide the body into the right time for rest. So when we do not sleep well, we're not only missing a few hours in bed, we may also be missing part of the process that restores memory, restores emotion, restores clarity, and restores inner continuity. And on the other hand, when we sleep enough and sleep in rhythm, what we receive is not only less sleepiness, we receive a fuller version of daytime consciousness. We remember more clearly, learn more effectively, feel calmer, and have a stronger sense of standing firmly inside our own lives. The strange thing is that every night, when our consciousness begins to dim, that is exactly when the brain quietly begins doing the work that helps us return as ourselves the next morning. And if we look back across the whole journey up to this point, we can see that this message has been flowing through every region of the night, from the threshold of sleep onset, where consciousness loosens little by little, to the passing images, the vague sounds, the falling sensation, the fragmented memories, the deep sleep, the vivid dreams, the states in between, and finally to memory being strengthened, emotion being processed, the brain being restored, and biological rhythm guiding us back into the cycle of tomorrow. All of it says the same thing. Sleep is not the empty zone of consciousness. Sleep is the journey of consciousness transforming itself, and it is precisely through that transformation that we can wake up not only with our eyes open, but with a mind that has been restored from within. Tonight, we have travelled together through something very familiar and yet deeply mysterious, the way human consciousness changes as it slowly sinks into sleep. We have seen that sleep is not an empty darkness where everything simply shuts off in silence. It is a remarkably delicate journey, where consciousness leaves the outer world layer by layer, passing through fragile thresholds of sleep, flashes of imagery, vague sounds, feelings that are half real and half dreamlike, and then moving deeper into the different layers of the night. We have seen that consciousness can fragment, can weave memory and emotion into dreams, can exist in strange in-between states, and can quietly change its form in ways that we ourselves usually do not even notice. But perhaps the most beautiful thing this journey leaves behind is a lighter feeling in the heart. Because after all, sleep is not the place where we lose ourselves. On the contrary, it may be the place where the brain quietly holds on to what needs to be kept, softens what is still too sharp, reorganizes memories that remain unfinished, and prepares us to return with a steadier mind the next morning. Once we understand that, perhaps we will fear restless nights a little less, worry less about those half-awake, half-dreaming moments, and stop feeling that sleep is some dark place beyond understanding. We may begin to see it instead as a living process, gentle, profound, and deeply meaningful for memory, emotion, recovery, and even for the feeling that we are still ourselves from one day to the next. If you have stayed with me all the way here, I hope tonight has brought you not only more knowledge, but also a small sense of peace. I hope that from now on, when you rest your head on the pillow, you will remember that consciousness does not disappear in some cold and distant way. It simply changes form slowly in the dark, like water changing colour under moonlight, only to return in the morning with a new kind of light. And maybe, simply by understanding that, you can relax a little more, trust your sleep a little more, and let the night hold you a little more gently. Thank you for staying with Sleep by Knowledge on tonight's journey. And now, if your eyes have grown heavier, if your breathing has grown slower, if your mind has softened even a little, then perhaps it is time to let every thought settle. I wish you a truly peaceful night, a deeply restful sleep, and a morning when you wake with a lighter heart and a brighter spirit. I will see you again on the next journey, where we will continue exploring the gentlest mysteries of human life and the world, very slowly, very deeply, and very peacefully. Very